Today, we're going to talk about regional landscape planning to avoid and mitigate environmental hazards. There are many types of hazards to consider in regional landscape planning. They can be based upon environmental characteristics, for example, topography, soils, land cover, and weather. They can be based upon land use, noise from highways, contaminant plumes from point sources, development. They generally involve certain geographic areas. They tend to be concentrated in certain geographic areas. For example, coastal hurricanes only occur in areas that are subject to coastal storms. And they're always exacerbated by human activity of one type or another. So these are sort of four underlying characteristics of the hazards that I'm going to be talking about today. In terms of hazard mitigation, there are at least three different strategies that we can use in trying to mitigate the effects of hazards in the landscape. First of all is avoid the impact through land use planning. Use different planning strategies as a way of guiding human activity in such a way that we avoid those areas that are particularly susceptible to certain types of hazards. We can lessen the impact by modifying the location in the landscape or on the site, move things around essentially. And we can lessen the impact by modifying the physical design of that which we're locating in the landscape. So on the one hand, we have kind of broader range, broader scale planning as a way of figuring out where best to locate things relative to minimizing risks to hazards. And on the other hand, we have quite detailed site and structural design consequences to think about as we implement the development plans in the landscape. Assessing hazards and risks involves identifying the hazard, identifying the nature and intensity of the hazard, and the spatial extent of hazard consequences. For example, in the upper left-hand map, the map of Staten Island, this is a map of Staten Island, New York, immediately after Hurricane Sandy, showing areas of the island that were inundated by the storm surge. We also want to talk about hazard exposure and vulnerability assessment. The images on the left-hand side here of the motel and the damage of the storm indicate areas that have high exposure and high vulnerability. And then finally, we can talk about risk analysis. What is the likelihood of occurrence? And so the map in the lower right shows the northeastern United States and the hurricane strike frequency of coastal areas along the northeastern United States. In terms of the different types of hazards that I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about them in 5 different parts of the lecture. We'll take a short break in between each part. First, I want to talk about flood hazards. Then in part 2, I want to talk about coastal storms and sea level rise. Then in parts 3, 4, and 5, I'm going to talk about geologic hazards and wildfire hazards. And under geologic hazards, I want to talk about earthquake fault zones, a process called liquefaction, tsunamis, volcanic activity, land subsidence, steep slope landslides and rockfall hazards, and saltwater intrusion. And then finally, I'll talk about wildfire. There are several other types of hazards that we could talk about: tornadoes, lightning, winter storms, extreme heat, drought. And some of these hazards, especially in Minnesota, such as tornadoes, are and winter storm, are particularly significant. However, these hazards tend to be difficult to anticipate, avoid, and mitigate. And typically the approach to planning that's taken is in the context of planning for emergency preparedness, as opposed to necessarily trying to figure out where the event is going to occur. Rather, the preparedness is, what do we do about it now that it has occurred? And how can we deploy resources to mitigate the damage? In the first part of the discussion, I want to talk about flood hazard and talk about avoidance and mitigation of flood hazards. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, produces a series of what are called 100-year floodplain maps, which identify flood-prone areas with various occurrence of likelihoods. Now, a floodplain is that land area that's inundated by a storm event occurring at a given frequency. So we can talk about the 100-year floodplain as being that land area that's inundated by a storm event that has a likelihood of occurring 1 year in 100 years. We can talk about a floodplain map associated with 10-year storm events. In other words, that portion of the landscape that's inundated by a storm occurring once every 10 years. So we can use this concept of flooding occurring, the amount of flooding that occurs from a storm event occurring in 1 year in 10 years, 1 year in 50 years, 1 year in 100 years, and 500 years. We can talk about the amount of the landscape, the spatial extent of the landscape that is inundated by the amount of precipitation and flooding that's generated by that kind of a storm event. The maps are used to locate and guide development to non-flood locations. In other words, to identify where the flooding is most likely to occur, and to try to create strategies to guide development to non-flood locations, and then also try to identify within these flood locations the severity of flooding, particularly the likelihood of flooding, and how we might begin to think about mitigation and hazard assessment. Mitigation strategies in the flood zone include flood control strategies that protect against flooding, land use and infrastructure design that can minimize or eliminate risks, and regulation of structural design and placement to help minimize damage. The structure of the 100-year floodplain, or any floodplain for that matter, involves a number of different concepts. In the upper left-hand diagram, we see the normal channel of, say, a river. The normal channel is the portion of the landscape that normally carries water flowing through the river. We can talk about that portion of the land into which the water in the normal channel normally overtops the river banks and flows out into what's called the floodway. This is the area of the landscape immediately adjacent to a normal channel that is inundated on a fairly regular basis. And then outside of the floodway, we have something called the flood fringe. And the flood fringe is that area beyond the floodway that is inundated by a flood having a particular frequency of occurrence. And so when we talk about the 100-year floodplain, we're talking about the normal channel and the floodplain of that normal channel. And then we're talking about the area of the landscape in addition to the floodway that's inundated by a storm produced by precipitation event that has a frequency of occurrence of 1 year in 100. The flood fringe exists symmetrically on both sides of the floodway, but it's not symmetrical in terms of its spatial extent or its characteristics, because its spatial extent is determined by topography and by land use and land cover. And then in addition to talking about the normal channel, the floodway, and the floodplain, including flood fringe, we also can talk about the base flood elevation, or the BFE. This is the elevation to which a normal channel will rise given the occurrence of a storm having a certain frequency of occurrence. So in this instance, we can talk about the 100-year floodplain and the 100-year base flood elevation being associated with the dashed line. The lower left-hand diagram shows a kind of a perspective drawing of the floodplain, showing the floodway itself, the flood fringe, and you can very clearly see here that the spatial extent of the flood fringe is going to depend entirely upon the characteristics of the landscape through which the river channel is running. These different portions of the floodplain become areas of thinking about different types of planning strategies and different types of development restrictions. In the river channel itself, obviously we're going to have the most restricted area, and the floodway itself is also considered highly restricted. Current strategies normally suggest that the river channel and the floodway not be developed at all, that there be efforts to try to protect the floodway and the river channel landscape associated with it from any kind of development that would be impacted negatively by the occurrence of a storm having a certain frequency of occurrence. Then within the flood fringe zone, the restrictions become less severe. The lower diagram on the right-hand side shows how the flood fringe area can vary considerably depending upon the topography and land use patterns that exist within the area of varying adjacencies to the river channel itself. The notion of hazard occurrence, how frequently does a storm event occur, is based upon percentage of occurrence. So we can talk about a 10-year event that is the storm event that's likely to occur 1 year in 10 years. We can talk about the 25-year event, the 50-year event, the 100-year event, the 500-year event. Typically, the events that are most commonly used in planning are the 10-year event, which is the event that we try to plan urban development areas to be able to accommodate stormwater that's coming off of the landscape. And then the 100-year event becomes the storm event around which we plan in terms of large-scale flooding. The 500-year event is even more stringent in terms of spatial extent of the landscape that's going to be flooded, because the 500-year storm event is going to produce a significantly greater impact in terms of the characteristics of the storm, the precipitation and so on that's generated by the storm. So you'll hear people talk about various year events, and basically that's the likelihood that the event is going to occur over time. This map shows floodway and 100-year floodplain mapping, and the red portion is the floodway. This is the portion of the landscape that's associated with the river channel itself, and you probably can't see, but peeking through the red, you can see a little bit of the river channel, and you can see that there's actually some development that has already occurred within the floodway itself. Generally speaking, as I said, the floodway is restricted to no development at all. The purple area represents the 100-year floodplain. So this is the spatial extent of the 100-year floodplain on both sides of Highway 10. This is up near Moorhead in Clay County. And then the blue areas represent those landscapes that are flooded by the 500-year storm event. These kinds of maps are produced for various communities around the country. This is the 100-year floodplain map for the area around Daytona Beach in Florida. And you can see that the map identifies clearly those portions of the landscape in orange that are included within the 100-year flood, 100-year, that are inundated by precipitation and flooding occurring once every 100 years. And the white areas are areas that are outside of that 100-year floodplain. They may be within the 500-year floodplain, but they're not within the 100-year floodplain. You can see that this often happens in various communities. Some of the communities, for example, Daytona Beach, this community here, has a significant portion of its jurisdiction that is outside of the 100-year floodplain, but roughly a half to 2/3 of the municipality is within the 100-year floodplain. On the other hand, some of the other communities have almost no areas within the 100-year floodplain. This is the city of Baltimore. This is a map produced by the Army Corps of Engineers, and it identifies both floodplains associated with water coming off of the landscape, the blue areas coming down out of the city of Baltimore, represent those areas that have a frequency of occurrence that varies depending upon whether we're talking about a 100-year storm event, a 500-year storm event. And then the areas in purple immediately adjacent to the Baltimore Harbor in the light blue represent those areas that are inundated by tidal surge that's associated with different kinds of storm events. And so we can see the tidal 500-year floodplain represents those areas that would be inundated by flood surge associated with a 500-year storm event. In Norfolk, Virginia, this map shows both the 100-year floodplain in the green color and the 500-year floodplain in the orange color. And so we can use this as a strategy for identifying areas that will have varying likelihoods of occurrence and areas that are not typically impacted by floodplains. And we can begin to plan for landscape planning strategies that vary depending upon the likelihood of flood occurrence taking place. Changes in land cover affect the base flood elevation within the floodplain. For example, under normal circumstances, without encroachment, the area that's inside of these sharp rectangles within the cross-section of the river channel represent zones of the floodplain that have been encroached upon, either by structures or by some other kind of modification. As the extent of the floodplain is reduced, the base flood elevation increases. And so we can see base flood elevation without encroachment extending from the dashed line across underneath of the area called surcharge. And then the upper line, the flood elevation when combined by encroachment, represents the excess water that will be generated because of the encroachment pattern itself. We also can talk about not just what's happening within the floodplain itself, but what's happening in the adjacent watershed. And in the undeveloped watershed that we see, we can talk about one particular base flood elevation to define the 10-year or the 100-year floodplain. But as soon as we start to develop the watershed itself, or even if we are talking about developing not just the floodplain of the watershed, but the upland portions of the watershed, as their surfaces become more impermeable, more water runs off across the surface. And so the floodplain limit goes up quite significantly without really any change in the spatial extent of the watershed, but simply because of change in land cover that's going more impermeable surfaces generating a much higher volume of runoff, expanding the base flood elevation, expanding the definition of the 100-year flood event. Flood maps identify flood-prone areas, but that's only part of the issue. We must also pay attention to land use and land cover in the impacted areas, the floodway and the floodplain, but also in upstream watershed of the impacted area. That's the concept of this diagram that shows what happens when there is no development in the watershed versus when there is development in the watershed, and how that affects the base flood elevation.